on Friday, we had reported that there was a letter that was sent to Dianne Feinstein alleging something to the effect, we hadn't seen the letter at that point, that Brett Kavanaugh had, as a teenager, in some fashion sexually assaulted a woman, or at that time a girl. And the question at that time was, why didn't Dianne Feinstein share this information with other members of the committee? The story has evolved a little bit as to her reasoning, right? Because they clearly messed up. If someone sends a letter to the committee, and we don't know the TikTok yet, as far as I know. The letter was sent in July. We don't know how much interaction Feinstein herself or staffers had with this woman, but clearly the woman was interested, at least putting this on the record. This should have been sent to the FBI at that time, even if it was deemed to be made confidential. Nevertheless, someone leaked it last week. Ryan Grimm had the story in The Intercepted. This weekend, the accuser made herself known, anticipating that her name was going to get out anyways, I think.
Mike Cernovich had people on that.
Is that right?
Yep.
Her name is Christine Blasey Ford. She is a professor of clinical psychology in California. And the most damning thing that is going to prove the most difficult thing for Brett Kavanaugh, who, remember now, has unequivocally denied these charges. And we'll say more about the other man who was with him at that time as to his denials. But put that aside. The most damning thing for Kavanaugh in this situation, and the hardest thing I think for the Republicans to do, because you know they're going to try and discredit this woman, is that in 2012, this woman told her couple's therapist and her husband about what she perceived as an attempted rape at that time. And the therapist has the notes. So for us to believe that Christine Blasey Ford is lying is for us to believe that she planned to promulgate this lie 6 years ago in anticipation if Kavanaugh ever was appointed or nominated to the Supreme Court, right? It wasn't enough as a federal court judge. She was holding back. And then the only other thing that you could say is that she is completely remembering this, that it was different people or that it never happened or whatnot, which is also a very hard thing to argue. We're not talking about a 3-year-old here. We're talking about when she was 15 years old. And so then the question was, would she testify? Her lawyer, Deborah Katz, went on the NBC Today show this morning with this.
Total strangers, and of course that's extremely unsettling.
Obviously, we've just heard the details of her story. She alleges a sexual assault back in high school. One of the therapist notes from a few years ago when she recounted this states that it was an attempted rape. My question to you is, does she consider this an attempted rape?
She does. She clearly considers this an attempted rape. She believes that if it were not for the severe intoxication of Brett Kavanaugh, she would have been raped.
The other person who was in the room, a man by the name of Mark Judge, according to your client, says this didn't happen. He said it's just nuts. This didn't happen. Your response?
Well, he's also written 3 books and many, many articles and Twitter posts that have all now been completely scrubbed from the public domain, where he acknowledges that that was behavior that from his Georgetown Prep School days, that they routinely engaged in tremendous drinking and really inappropriate behavior, and that the drinking was so severe that they were blacked out regularly. That's now been scrubbed.
Yeah. Ms. Katz, is your client willing to testify before the Judiciary Committee publicly and tell this story?
She is. She's willing to do whatever it takes to get her story forth, yes.
First off, it needs to be said that this woman, Christine Ford, has an incredible amount of, and to a certain extent, this is not unlike what happened with Anita Hill. Anita Hill initially had no desire to testify. She felt obligated to notify the committee of her experience of working with Clarence Thomas, and her name was leaked. And then at that point, she wanted to at least have an ability to impact what her fate was going to be. And it certainly appears that it's the same situation with Christine Ford. Once it became clear that there were reporters who were camping out on her door before she was public, she realized that she has to take control of the narrative. And the idea that she is willing to testify, it seems almost impossible for Republicans in the Senate to avoid reopening the hearings if they want this nomination to go forward. Almost impossible, only because I have some experience with the Republican Party. With that said, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, they have the ability, by telling Mitch McConnell, we are going to vote no if you have this vote in the committee on Thursday without reopening, they have the ability to dictate what happens next. No one should forget this. If you live in Maine and you live in Alaska, and even if you don't, it is definitely worthwhile to let those 2 senators know that they have the ability to stop this process dead in its tracks. They hold all the cards. And we are going to watch the right move from these are ridiculous and anonymous to, well, she's lying, to, well, he was only 17, to he was really drunk and didn't know what he was doing. That's the way this is going to progress.
They're already doing it.
Okay. And then the question is, there's plenty of times where people do things when they are 17 and highly intoxicated, and they do it only once and they regret it. And those people who are not disingenuous liars do not later deny that they did it. They do not then say, she is a liar and she is trying to derail my nomination to the Supreme Court. What they do is they step forward and they accept responsibility for what they did. And they talk about how they realized it was a mistake and they lived with that for many years and it impacted their behavior and it changed them, and they understand that this can happen and that it's wrong. And then, like a person like that, there's something to be said judging their credibility of and their lives up to that point, that maybe that person is suited to sit on the Supreme Court, or to any court for that matter, to be in a position to adjudicate behavior. Now, I also don't think you could take this incident and Brett Kavanaugh's complete unequivocal denial. And remember, it's not just him coming out and saying, I don't know about this. It is, let's get a letter with 63 women that I supposedly knew in high school at the all-boys school I went to. and get them to support me. Let's get the let's do what every other Supreme Court judge is and bring out every female basketball team I coached. Let's have every woman I know. Like, this denial is not just when he said this, when it came out. This denial has been in the works for weeks.
Carpool dad.
For weeks. This is not a denial. It's a campaign of denial. Now, maybe they did it just for this one incident. Maybe there's other incidents. But if it's just this one incident, this guy is so far away from accepting responsibility that it's impossible for us to believe that it was a meaningless event, right? Because even if it was not a meaningless event, even if it was the worst thing that he did as a 17-year-old, but it shouldn't count against him today as a Supreme Court nominee, then he should have had the ability to say, I disavow that. I learned from that. I don't do that. And yet, instead, what we get is a campaign of denial. So there's no excuse for this guy. That time has passed. And now it's up to Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, because we now know that every Democrat is going to vote against this guy if it's brought up to a vote. And we see nothing else. There's no reason that this has to go forward without a hearing here. Now, I don't know if there's any ability to get to the bottom of this. And I certainly wouldn't vote for this guy, but I wouldn't have voted for this guy before. But the idea of having some measure of not necessarily a contemporaneous record, but one that predates this, his nomination by 6 years. I mean, I'd like to hear the explanation as to what was in her mind when she told her couples therapist this 6 years ago, if it wasn't true.
Yeah, one thing that jumps out at me about this whole thing is that it's often used against rape victims, the fact that they were drinking, you know, like, oh, if you were drinking, how can you possibly remember this properly? You know, you're an unreliable witness to your own rape. And if that is the case, I don't see why this doesn't also apply to the accused, right? Because this guy, at least his friend, has a documented history of being blackout drunk at that point in his life. So maybe they should say, you know, if you were drinking, how can you be sure you didn't rape somebody?
Right. Well, the point is, you don't even have to get that far. The point is, like, if there's someone can take some measure of responsibility for their actions because they're drinking too much, it cuts both ways. But the really damning thing about her story is this is not well, maybe someone misinterpreted the signs or this and that. I mean, if her story is true, this is a guy who knew that there was no consent. That's why they raised the sound of the stereo so that people wouldn't hear her saying no.
Well,
he put his hand over her mouth. I mean, this isn't one of those like people were drinking, nobody could tell what was going on. I mean, this is clearly. So there's no. This is a. I would like to see Brett Kavanaugh explain this. Explain like why he thinks this woman told her therapist about it 6 years ago.
and why, if you were making up a story, you would have the corroborating witness in the room be one of his friends.
Right, exactly. Like, why would you have a friend in there?
Yeah.
Right, if you're making this up, like, that's a really, really
risky
strategy.
Not to mention, if you were going to make up a story, wouldn't you make it even worse?
Indeed.
Like, this is very specific.
No, I mean, I think it is going to be impossible for Murkowski and Collins to ignore this. And that's what they would have to do to move forward. We will talk more about Mark Judge later and in more of this, because this is obviously a big deal. And look, well, there's a lot more to this. There's every reason to believe that the Republicans are going to, if Kavanaugh's nomination goes down, they're going to nominate someone from a ideological standpoint just as bad.